Now, joining us at the very late hour of about 20 past 11 from the United States for our conference is Paul Gallagher. He's the Economics Intelligence Director for Executive Intelligence Review, and someone who has followed very closely and written articles in the EIR on this subject of the global financial crash, the unfolding global financial crash. This will be an hour-long panel. We will take questions to Paul after Paul's presentation, and we'll go for an hour. The title of his presentation is The Unfolding Global Financial Crash and the Nascent New Institutions. Thank you, Paul. Welcome to our conference.
Thank you. And thank you for that welcome. And welcome from near Washington in the United States in the middle of the night. I want to talk to you about the actual condition of the economies of the United States and Europe, the transatlantic economies, and the tremendous contrast and antagonism with the developments that are now coming from the BRICS, particularly from the new credit institutions, and most particularly the AIIB and the related credit institutions that China is initiating along the Silk Road, the economic road and belt. 9 months ago, I wrote an article in EIR back in July of 2014 called The U.S. Suicidal War on the New Chinese Infrastructure Bank, and said at that time that President Obama's campaign against the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB, would fail, and that the United States would be its only victim. That disastrous defeat for Obama has now occurred. He is completely isolated and defeated in his vindictive attempt to prevent this vital credit initiative for the world economy to come into being. But if Obama is now rejected and dumped through the 2016 campaign for the presidency here in the United States, then the U.S. can still reclaim the principle of Hamiltonian economics, which is the actual offer that the Chinese are making through the AIIB and which Obama attempted to destroy. When I wrote that article in July of last year, I reported that the Obama administration's moves to try to prevent cooperation with China's planned AIIB were part of its commitment to a London-centered financial empire, which is headed for another, more thorough collapse and threatened world war as a result. Now the U.S. economy is again falling into recession, supposedly only its second since the 2008 financial crash, although Europe and Japan more frankly admit to having had at least three. The recovery that the U.S. economy has been a myth. It's an economy without high wage employment, without capital investment, as I'll show, without any growth in crude productivity, with vanishing levels of real economic productivity, and long vanished investment in modern infrastructure. In the European economies, where mass unemployment has persisted under the single currency for over a decade, even the most basic lending by banks to businesses and households is continuing to decline as we're speaking every year in absolute terms. And these transatlantic economies are joined at the hip by their megabanks, which have been sustained and which have grown much larger since their crash by Federal Reserve lending and money printing spread equally over both sides of the Atlantic. Now, knowing that the transatlantic financial system is crashing doesn't require picking out and identifying the precise crash trigger or some so-called black swan event, as leading British financial columnists are trying to do now, for example, in the sudden, quote, loss of liquidity in the bond markets, unquote. The bank panic and financial crash of 07-08 required the collapse of an immense real estate bubble featuring $7 trillion in mortgage-backed securities in the U.S. alone and 65 trillion in various forms of credit derivatives piled on top of them. The current financial crash doesn't require any such huge triggering events. The transatlantic banks are much bigger and still more complex, but the transatlantic economies have shrunken, they are poorer, they are less productive, and there are plenty of debt bubbles, not to mention 600 trillion in interest rate derivatives that are ready to finish them off. The transatlantic economies are being crushed by the Wall Street and London banks, including their control of government financial and even economic policy. Even compare GDP, which is grossly inflated by financial services and stock market bubbles. Between 2007 and 2014, in Europe as a whole, the growth is roughly zero. In China, the growth is roughly 68% during those years. In India, 38%. Now, international institutions such as the OECD and the IMF agree, even in their consistently rose-colored forecasts, that the average of economic growth around the world is falling and is likely to be below 2% in 2015, despite rapid growth in the biggest BRICS. In the United States in recent weeks, the Atlanta Federal Reserve has dismayed the Wall Street press with the published tracking of its new so-called real-time GDP Now measure. This showed U.S. growth going at an annual rate of 1.9% in early February, at 1.2% at the start of March, at 0.6% on March 12th, at 0.3% on March 18th, and at 0.2% on March 25th. These are some broad measures. There are some broad measures which relate this to the real economy. For example, international agricultural equipment and sales fell by 2% in 2012, rose by 4% in 2013, and then fell by a whopping 7% in 2014. Global shipping cargoes, other than oil, are falling in absolute terms. The Baltic Dry Index of shipping prices is 40% of what it was in 2005 and 25% of what it was in the year 2000, and it is continuing to fall. Almost all commodity prices are deeply depressed. The volume of world trade did not grow in 2012, contracted in 2013, has grown by about 3% in 2014, and at the start of 15 is contracting once again. The value in dollars of world trade has been declining since 2011. The value added in manufacturing for the world as a whole recovered after the crash to grow in 2010 to 12, but fell back to zero growth in 2013 and contracted in 2014. And in the European Union, 26 countries, manufacturing value added is at the level of 2005. Official unemployment in the European Union nations as a whole has not gone below 11% since the financial crash 7 years ago, and real unemployment, including the underemployed and the labor force dropouts, is 19% for the entire continent. Youth unemployment is 26% officially for the entire continent. Not only Greece's GDP is below the level of 2008, it's 25% below, but also those of Portugal, Spain, and Italy. Ireland's is now only equal to what it was 7 years ago. All these countries have declining and emigrating populations. Mortgage loans for home purchases in Europe are below the total level of 15 years ago. Total loans, bank credit, are at the same absolute level as 2006. And if you exclude loans by banks to other banks, they are 6% lower than they were at that time. Total bank credit has been falling by 100 billion euros per year. Bad debt is estimated at 2.5 trillion euro in the European banking system out of 23 trillion total assets, more than 10%. Yet the derivatives exposure of Europe's banks, overwhelmingly in London, including Deutsche Bank, is about 400 trillion, or 10% larger than in 2007. If the Eurozone starts to fall apart with a Greek default on bailout debt, which may happen imminently, derivatives bubbles will explode. And the ECB just yesterday issued an alert to all banks in Europe to inform the ECB, the European Central Bank, about their exposure to Austria, where the government had to withdraw guarantees for toxic bank debt, leading to 2 bank failures so far. In the United States, the amount of employment is increasing, but Americans' average real wages and salaries, hourly and weekly, are continuing to fall. The hallmarks of household poverty, use of food stamps, charity food kitchens, homelessness, continue to increase. An average of 15 million Americans needed to participate in food assistance programs in 2001, 25 million in 2007, 48 million in 2014, and still growing. Real weekly wages and salaries of American workers are 20% below the level of 1972, if a consistent measure of inflation is used over that whole span. And the income of households is unchanged over that 40 years, requiring almost 1.5 persons per household to work for that income now, whereas just 1.1 persons worked for it then. More than half of American workers are now employed either part-time, as temps through contractors, temporary workers, or as freelance workers. Hourly pay has fallen. It is 10% lower than 40 years ago and 15% lower than 7 years ago when Obama took office. That makes the so-called manufacturing recovery claimed by the Obama administration in the United States a fraud. Ironically, the most detailed treatment showing this fraud was written by President Obama's own former car czar, that is, banker Stephen Ratner, who was in charge of Obama's claimed recovery and revival of the auto industry for 3 years. His recent article in The Atlantic was called, "What Manufacturing Recovery?" Electricity use per capita in the United States has fallen steadily since 2007 by a total of 15%. Investment in infrastructure construction in the United States, which once was 3.2% of annual GDP in the mid-2060s, has reached a nadir under Obama of 1.3% of GDP. So there has been no creation of any buffer of credit, of new credit, productively invested to counteract the devastating effects of the financial crash of 07-08 and the following mass unemployment. There is a lack of capital investment throughout the U.S. economy since the effective elimination of Glass-Steagall in the Glass-Steagall principles or regime in the middle 1990s. In the 13 years of the Bush and Obama presidencies, the debt of U.S. corporations rose spectacularly, from a total of $5 trillion in 2001 to $7 trillion in 2006, $11 trillion in 2009, and $15 trillion at the end of 2014. Corporate after-tax profits did the same thing, rising from $500 billion in 2001 to $1.4 trillion in 2009, and then after dropping in the crash for 18 months, rose rapidly again to $1.75 trillion in 2004. But during the same period, corporations' capital expenditures essentially were unchanged at about $900 billion per year. When one considers that depreciation of capital, business capital, is about $1.1 trillion a year in the United States, net capital investment in the entire economy is negative and has been negative for a decade and a half. This is because 90% of what the corporations borrow and very much of their profit has gone purely directly back into the stock market. The constant buying back of their own shares to drive up their prices, or buying other corporation shares in mergers and acquisitions and paying out dividends to shareholders. In 2014, for example, the two figures I gave you just before of corporate borrowing and corporate profits in 2014 added to perhaps $2.8 trillion in available capital, which could be invested in capital expenditures. 2.35 trillion of the 2.8 trillion went directly into stock buybacks and mergers and acquisitions. This doesn't even count dividend payments. Such a corporate debt buyback cycle has not characterized the U.S. economy since the 1920s, before the bank and market crash of 29-31 and the Great Depression. This kind of corporate debt stock buyback cycle rules out any real productivity advances in the economy and rules out any real productivity and anything but continuously declining real wages. There is a fundamental measure of what is sitting on top of this declining real economy and ready to collapse. This is the explosion of the amount of debt, that is, total debt, including government at all levels, debt of corporations, debt of households. That total debt to the gross domestic product. Stated differently, the amount of new debt which is apparently needed to generate an additional amount of GDP, however productive or unproductive that GDP may be. In the United States economy, that ratio was remarkably constant. From the end of World War II until 1975, 30 years, it was 100%, or $1 of additional debt for $1 of additional GDP. Then rather suddenly, after the 1971-73 breakup of Bretton Woods, which Lyndon LaRouche had forecast at the time, that ratio started to rise steadily. It grew to 250% by 2000. Then, following the destruction of the Glass-Steagall bank regulations, it leaped in just 5 years to 350% in 2005. And then, despite the 07-08 crash and all the debt which was wiped out by it, the ratio continued to grow and reached approximately 400% in 2014. So it was the growth of national product which was wiped out by the crash 7 years ago, but not the growth of debt. And the total nominal value of the over-the-counter derivatives of the mega banks, which the BIS thought was roughly $550 trillion at the end of 2007, just before the crash, it now estimates at well over $700 trillion, overwhelmingly concentrated in a dozen banks on Wall Street and in the City of London. So you can pick your bubble among the financial bubbles which have formed since the 07-08 crash, which will trigger this follow-up crash. There's $500 billion in unpayable Eurozone bailout debt. There's $850 billion in corporate leveraged loans in the U.S. economy, $1.6 trillion in junk bonds, $800 billion in subprime auto loans, and these things are not yet as large as the pre-crash $7 trillion mortgage-backed securities bubble, but they are growing faster than it did. And more importantly, they're being piled on an economy which is less productive, with less productive employment and less real demand than even that of the first decade of this century. Another financial collapse is built in fact is underway, unless a Glass-Steagall bank reorganization and national credit for productive projects are implemented now. Now, there are not only warnings now in the financial columns, but also crash warnings from official bodies. On March 20th, the Bank for International Settlements issued a warning about, quote, high debt and low prices in the oil sector. This is a quote from them: a toxic mix of high levels of debt in the oil sector and a sharp decline in the price of the commodity could have far-reaching effects on the global economy. The total debt of the gas and oil sector worldwide stands at roughly $2.5 trillion, 2.5 times what it was at the end of 2006. I'm still quoting: at collapsed oil prices, it may have no more than 350 to 400 billion in revenues to service this 2.5 trillion in debt, leading to a collapse of the debt, the BIS warned. The U.S. Office of Financial Research, which does research for the major bank regulators in the United States, part of the U.S. Treasury, made a report on March 18th that the United States appears to be on the verge of a financial markets crash. The OFR cited 3 technical debt bubble measures, which it said matched the levels of 29, 2000, and 2007. But the OFR focused on the extraordinarily high level of leveraged loan debt bubble relative to lending and credit generally. And in a March 11th speech, the chairman of the FDIC, the Deposit Insurance Corporation in the United States, Mr. Thomas Honig, announced the same warning about these leveraged loans, which are a close cousin of the 1.6 trillion junk bond bubble. This warning came out of a national credit quality report, which the FDIC did from an asset sampling of all the banks in the United States. Thomas Honig said that the survey found the leveraged loan bubble had grown to $850 billion in the U.S. banking system at the end of 2014, from only $380 billion 2 years earlier. A second report by the same Office of Financial Research in the Treasury, issued the same day, found that the six biggest U.S. banks have an apparent $10 trillion in their assets, but they have another $5 trillion in exposure, that is, meaning to derivatives. This is their computer model calculations, meaning they claim they have $5 trillion in value at risk in their derivatives exposures, which in nominal terms are over $230 trillion. $5 trillion in exposure unbacked by any capital would be bad enough, but it has been clear in practice since the collapse of the long-term capital management back in '99 that when huge bets on a debt bubble go wrong and every firm is trying to close out every derivative contract in the same direction at the same time, a financial institution's liability can explode to anything up to the full nominal value of the derivatives exposure. Again, talking about $230 trillion in the case of these six largest banks. Then there is the central banks of the United States, Japan, and Britain have in fact created the biggest and most dangerous bubble directly themselves. And it is in this regard that we begin to understand the 180-degree difference of what the BRICS new credit institutions are set up to do, and what their importance is. Between the U.S. Federal Reserve, Bank of Japan, European Central Bank, and Bank of England, they have printed the equivalent of $8 trillion to buy securities from their biggest banks. The Fed alone has printed over $4 trillion through its 4 different quantitative easing programs. Of that, almost equal amounts went to the mega banks in the United States and those in Europe. None of this mass of money, which was printed for the biggest banks, has been loaned out. The 6 biggest U.S. banks' deposits, for example, rose by $2.2 trillion from 2008 to 2013. Their so-called excess reserves increased by more than $2 trillion at the same time. Their lending dropped by $700 billion at the same time. Since mid-2013, the Federal Reserve has reported gradual increases in bank lending, but tellingly, 5 of the 6 biggest banks in their own audited financial reports have continued to show their lending either stagnating or falling further up to the present time. So while they have 65% of all the deposits in the whole banking system of the country, thanks to the Fed, they have turned this into speculative money. It's in financial derivatives, securities, swaps, repo loans to other banks and non-banks, shadow banks, and financial companies and funds. It's not in the real economy through loans. All of the masses of this central bank money printing have produced one thing: excess reserves of the banks held at the central banks, which is flowing in and out of various securities and derivatives bubbles. And then they have produced something stranger: bubbles in the government debt of the United States, Germany, and other major countries themselves. Now, it was a principle of Alexander Hamilton's first bank that bank would not buy U.S. government debt, that it would make loans against government debt as collateral held by the borrowers, but that the only government debt the bank would hold was that which was put into it as capital stock when it was founded. This was likewise a principle of President Madison's second bank and of Henry Clay's act to create a third bank in 1841, which was enacted by Congress but vetoed by the successor of a conveniently assassinated President Harrison. Now we have the spectacle of three central banks, the Fed, the ECB, and the Bank of Japan, at various times buying the majority of all of the debt issued by their governments, trying to provide more and more reserves to financial institutions which stubbornly refuse to lend them. This quantitative easing practice eventually has driven the interest rates on even the medium-term bonds of the major transatlantic governments down towards zero, and eventually it has also created scarcities of these bonds. In effect, these governments have been deprived of the ability to raise large bond issues for infrastructure from their own publics, as Egypt did so successfully last summer for the second Suez Canal. $9 billion equivalent raised in Egyptian currency from Egyptians alone within the space of 8 days in order to build that second canal. This is what has been cut off by the zero interest rate quantitative easing program of the major central banks. German bond rates, for example, are too low for savings or retirement bonds, too low for insurance companies to buy them for their risk reserves. Rather, all but the longest-term government notes and bonds have become leading instruments of financial speculation in the world. In the repo markets, in the derivatives markets, it's said that every hedge fund in the United States and Europe has invested heavily in the same bet. That is, a long bet on 10-year U.S. Treasury bonds, meaning betting that their interest rates will go down still further after 7 years of steady decline. The current financial media rumors of an imminent crash in the bond markets, therefore, are that these bond markets are becoming illiquid. The London financial press are now publishing repeated alarms, including from official sources. For example, The Telegraph on March 21st, quote, "But it is the corporate bond market where worries about trading conditions are most acute. The ultra-loose monetary policies pursued by the Fed, Bank of England, and European Central Bank have resulted in a torrent of bond issuance in recent years, seeking to capitalize on rock-bottom interest rates. A rate hike by the U.S. Federal Reserve, which would be the first since 2006, could trigger turmoil." Still quoting, "Last week, the Bank for International Settlements cautioned that liquidity was concentrating in the most readily traded securities and that conditions were deteriorating in the less liquid ones. Perhaps the most arresting warning came last November when the International Capital Market Association surveyed investors, analysts, and traders of European corporate bonds and concluded that the common fear was that a meltdown of global credit markets had become unavoidable. The bond markets are in fact not becoming illiquid. Rather, all of the liquidity in them is buying the same bonds and derivatives, while others, for example, now the hundreds of billions of high-interest bonds of shale oil drillers and related companies have become illiquid. This is what happened 10 years ago when U.S. mortgage-backed securities and their derivatives became the bet that every bank and fund had to be and in big. If the crash is triggered in this way, the central banks will have done it directly themselves. So now let's look at these nascent international credit institutions over against this. The formation by China and the BRICS countries of a series of new international credit banks for infrastructure has unleashed the potential to create the first real economic growth in decades along the Silk Road and Belt, including in Africa and the Middle East. It also carries the potential to reverse years of economic collapse in the transatlantic system, the United States and Europe. The United States, as I mentioned, scrapes the bottom of all industrial countries by investing just 1.3% of its GDP in economic infrastructure. The EU countries are really no better, with an average of 1.7%. This compared to 4.8% currently for India, 8 to 9% in China every year since 1992. Net investment in infrastructure in Germany, the economic powerhouse of Europe, has been negative for 10 years. That's why, to cite one example, the bridge over the Rhine River near EIR's Wiesbaden office is closed and unusable, with no other bridge over Germany's most important river for 40 kilometers to the north and 50 kilometers to the south. But the United States economy faces a much more terrible breakdown than anything occurring or threatened in Europe. That is that the entire arid, semi-arid, western and southwestern regions of the United States are rapidly running out of water for uses essential to modern human life. California, the most affected state, has been estimated just now by the space agency NASA to have just 1 year of water supplies remaining. Even somewhat increased rains this winter have not affected the deepening drought condition in the slightest. Irrigated agriculture has already been lost, food production as well as industrial production has been cut, but the most tragic aspect is that nothing is being done by governments and nothing is being planned by governments to bring back additional water supply to the region. Given this absolute feeble economic sterility, the drought may easily continue long enough to make desert of and depopulate the United States' most productive region. So the United States under Obama has now become the isolated adversary of the AIIB and other Silk Road development banks. But the United States remains the critical nation to join China in this global spanning investment. Why? It's important to understand that China has been the sole source of credit in the world, for the world, since the 2008 crash. It has been until very recently the planet's one and only credit driver, the one nation holding back an economic dark age. As I mentioned earlier, the Federal Reserve printed $4 trillion in QE programs, purely building $4 trillion, purely building up major banks' deposits and excess reserves for purposes of speculation. This newly printed money does not enter the economy through bank lending. It merely drives up the value of assets held by financial institutions and traded among them. But the state banks of China have issued credit, if you like, printed money, at the rate of $4 trillion equivalent per year since 2009, in the range of $20 trillion in total, leveraging even China's huge currency reserves by 5 times. And the vast majority of this world historical credit flow has not been for their private banks, but for every other sector of their economy. So it is a considerable understatement to say that China has been the only economy in the world which has maintained its growth through the crash and collapse. It has maintained the world's growth, the world's demand for machinery and commodities and new technologies. China used between 2011 and 2013, that is in 3 years, as much cement, and this is considering only high-quality grades of cement, as the United States used in the entire 20th century, about 4 gigatons, 4 billion tons. Scores and scores of new cities were built of over 1 million people each, hydroelectric and water management projects on a very large scale, incredible transport and port development, 2/3 of all the construction cranes in use in the world. China built between 2006 and 2014 a 16,000-kilometer network of high-speed rail lines, larger than Europe's entire high-speed network, equal to all the rest of the high-speed rail in the world, and is building another 10,000 kilometers now. We don't need to discuss the development of its space and fusion energy programs during those same few years. So then think of the demand which Lyndon LaRouche made in a statement approximately 1 month ago. Collapse Wall Street and the City of London. Let that bad debt go, but create a buffer of credit for productive employment of populations. So Wall Street and London did the collapsing. The transatlantic nations and Japan provided the bailouts to save them from collapsing, while China provided the only buffer of new productive credit. But during that time, China has been acting against the worst of economic circumstances and the worst of financial practices by the global banks. So some of this immense amount of credit issuance, therefore, went into debt bubbles in real estate and commodities, eagerly abetted by the carry trade money printed by the Federal Reserve and Bank of Japan and flowing through London's Hong Kong banking center into shadow banking in China. Some of the credit went into what is now overcapacity in manufacturing in China. That is due in part to the collapse of the real economic markets of Europe and the United States. This credit is reflected in the form of debt, and some of it is now unpayable. Now, through the breakthrough of forming the BRICS and the Silk Road credit institutions, China is assisted in its policy of redirecting some of this debt and new credit not only away from shadow banking and commodity bubbles, but also away from manufacturing investment and into new high-technology infrastructure, education, and scientific progress, future productivity. Thereby, it can also mobilize its huge domestic savings, which are estimated at $8 trillion equivalent, through these institutions and into investments in productivity advances in much of the rest of the world. India will also do the same through these institutions and also build its manufacturing sector, which has lagged well behind up to now. This is Hamiltonian credit. Hamiltonian credit is the reorganization of debt, including sometimes unpayable debt, and its redirection into investment in the future productivity of mankind. Alexander Hamilton's own First Bank of the United States reorganized America's debts, both the payable and the unpayable, and directed them by replacing them with new, longer-term debt backed by taxes, but much more importantly, invested in creating a national transport capability, ironworks, and other manufacturers for the creation of the United States economy during the subsequent 19th century. This is completely opposed to a policy of printing money to create excess private bank reserves and inflate assets. So U.S. debt, as well as the European, urgently needs to be directed away from what is now zero interest issue of debt by governments, creation of bank reserves thereby, and speculative instruments benefiting only Wall Street. In effect, China has already done this with its U.S. Treasury holdings, as was noted just yesterday by an astute German banker who was interviewed from Beijing by the German financial publication Wirtschaftswoche. He said that the paper money issued by the U.S. Treasury was in part being recreated by China into infrastructure investment, that is, through their holdings of U.S. Treasury securities and their investment through these credit institutions. Because the U.S. dollar has been the world's reserve currency and nearly $13 trillion worth of U.S. Treasury debt is publicly held, the conversion of even a small portion of that debt into a credit bank to work directly with the new BRICS credit institutions would be decisive for the whole Silk Road infrastructure project and for the revival of the U.S. economy as well. It would decisively raise transatlantic government bond interest rates as well, away from zero, so that they can mobilize public savings for infrastructure investment in addition to the credit buffer of such a credit bank. Obama's suicidal campaign against the AIIB is the worst defeat of a presidency which has piled up many such disasters. In my view, Obama's defeat on this ranks with the disaster of Churchill's Gallipoli campaign, which I think Australians know something about. Churchill was dumped as a result of that campaign. Obama has to be dumped now, and LaRouche has said in the process of this presidential campaign, he should be dumped. Think, for example, of what Franklin Roosevelt, having been elected but still 5 months away from the presidency, did to effectively paralyze Herbert Hoover by simply opposing and refusing to collaborate in anything that Hoover proposed or did. That effectively removing Hoover from the presidency during that entire period of time, in which what was going on in Congress and what was going on in preparation for the presidency was being directed by Roosevelt and not by Hoover. LaRouche has called for the dumping of Obama, neutralization and dumping of him as a result of this tremendous defeat that he has suffered in the course of this campaign. If that happens, the United States, which is the decisive nation along with China in creating this new universe of productive infrastructure credit, the United States can then join in that endeavor. And that, of course, is the purpose of our organizing and part of the purpose of this conference that I know you're holding. So having said that about the crash here and the AIIB and other new and nascent credit institutions, let me leave some time, if you do have some questions or comments, to respond to them.
Okay, well, this is a question from Sleeman Johanna, works in our full-time in our office here. I know that China is different, but my question is, despite the financial and economic sanctions against Russia by the West, could you give us a reality check and comparison between the EU, USA and the Russian economy? Thanks.
Well, the Russian economy has very different kinds of problems. It has very serious limitations on it, which have to do with basically the dependence on imports of various kinds, which have been cut off, and both those which have been cut off and those which have not, but where the import dependency is still a weakness. And also, the most powerful blow which has been delivered to it is the so-called Saudi sanction, the oil sanction, which has made much more damaging impact on the Russian economy than any of the sanctions that were imposed through the EU, NATO, and so on. It has been that oil sanction which has really hurt them. There has clearly been a move towards real integration, not only political support among China, India, and Russia. The political support has been stated very publicly and clearly, for example, by Li Keqiang, the Prime Minister of China, and by Prime Minister Modi in India and others in his government. The political support for Russia in the face of these sanctions has been made very clear. Actions are following words in that respect in terms of direct credit support for the Russian oil and related industries, and just in recent days, India, in addition to long-standing cooperation, has also started to make investments into Crimea, for example, in order to develop some modern industry in Crimea, which is still semi cut off even from the Russia which has rejoined. So there are serious problems there which don't look to Russia to don't look to Russia to make large contributions to the issuance of credit through these development banks. And that's part of the reason why I concentrated so much on the United States. It is the critical question. It has more. There's more of a potential contribution to real development credit from the United States than all of the European nations which have joined the AIIB combined. The United States, because of what I went through in the world reserve currency and the very large amount of publicly held debt, is in a position to really do things here. Don't look for Russia to provide that kind of input, but rather scientific input and industrial input of critical types. Nuclear construction is emblematic of that. It is really, at the moment, although it may be overtaken by China, but at the moment, really the world's leader in full nuclear plant construction and in new modalities of nuclear plant construction. So it will contribute, but not credit.
Jim Hazard. Paul, why doesn't Putin take over his central bank that's being run by a monetarist at the moment, charging 50% interest? Why doesn't he just take it over and create Hamiltonian credit through that bank, the same as China is doing today?
Well, I can't really be Vladimir Putin or speak for him. We know what has been proposed, and what you just proposed has been proposed repeatedly by one of his advisors, Sergei Glasiev, and that is, of course, a very strong and long-standing connection to the writings and views of Lyndon LaRouche, who Sergei Glasiev brought to Russia more than once to speak in the Duma and elsewhere there. Those have so far been Glasiev's has been an isolated voice. Putin certainly could do what you're proposing, although I think much more readily by using I believe it's called a National Welfare Fund, or that's a rough translation of it into English, which has been created and has been used only or almost exclusively as reserves for the defense of the Russian currency. It essentially has been kept in reserve and not used as development credit. Such a credit bank, I think, could be more readily created that way, but certainly it's there to do. The reason that he doesn't do it appears to be because of the disease of monetarism infecting almost all of his team of economic advisors and his financial and economic officials. And we just have to attack that in every opportunity that we have to organize Russians, both with contacts in the government and without, because that disease of monetarism is running their policy.
Paul, my name's Alan. The room's gone a bit quiet here just at the moment, so I think we're all thinking about your words. You probably can't give financial advice, but if you were going to give some advice, where would you put your money when this crash comes?
I only understood the last few words, but about putting your money where the crash comes.
The age-old question that everyone's sitting on the edge of their seat waiting for your answer. Where do you put your money so it's safe?
Well, it would do everybody who's waiting for that answer good to study well, Robbie's going to deal with it immediately after me here, to study the real history and workings of the Hamiltonian national banks in the United States, because the genius of those banks is that they were national banks of the United States, and you and I could open accounts in them and borrow money from them. So there's where you want to put your money. The thing is, you have to create it first.
Considering that most of the United States government was bought by bankers, dumping Obama, wouldn't that bring one of the same back. Therefore, what other options would Americans have?
We just had that's a very important question. I would bet that Helga dealt with this in part in her presentation, but let me go at it too. It's a very important question. We had a major episode in December of the Wall Street banks running roughshod over the Congress in a very public way. Everybody could see it. The media all reported it. The average American could see very clearly. The Wall Street banks intervened directly to tear up banking regulations, which were weak enough to begin with. They had been passed 5 years ago as part of the Dodd-Frank bill, but they had not really taken effect. When they were about to take effect, finally, they were repealed on the direct bribery and threat of Citibank, J.P. Morgan Chase. There were infamous incidents where President Obama and Jamie Dimon, the CEO of Morgan Chase, were simultaneously calling and whipping the same members of Congress to vote for the provisions to repeal these bank regulations. And what they were repealing were the few regulations which forced the banks to take only the very riskiest derivatives, the commodity derivatives, the uncleared credit derivatives, and move them outside the commercial banks so they wouldn't be, so the taxpayer wouldn't be insuring them, and move them into separate firms. But since that was less profitable to the banks, they simply crushed it. This was so dramatic and so obvious that it led to a backlash immediately, so that the repeal of these regulations, which they were rushing through the Congress, very nearly failed at the last minute because there was a joint revolt in both the Senate and the House at the same time, which rarely happens. That is, where members of the Senate and members of the House get together to try to stop something. And it was a public revolt, and it created what some called at that time a Glass-Steagall moment, where it hit quite a lot of members of Congress and others at that time that there was nothing but Glass-Steagall could possibly work, that the regulations which they had been told were, quote, just as good as Glass-Steagall had just been ripped up by the bankers. And that didn't immediately win any victories in Congress, but now, as you undoubtedly know, a major candidate for the Democratic nomination for president has started his campaign on the basis of restoring Glass-Steagall. And that is the former governor of Maryland, Martin O'Malley, and that is his main thrust in his campaigning, is restore Glass-Steagall, and he doesn't mince words about it. He says, break up the Wall Street banks. Some of those banks have to be closed down. The heads of those banks have to go to prison. That's what I'm campaigning around. He's also gone after Obama for the kind of regime change wars that the United States has fought under Obama, the disasters of those wars. So this backlash has now materialized into a potential fight in the presidential campaign itself, which are the things that Americans pay more attention to than anything else politically, the presidential election fights. Glass-Steagall is now in the middle of that, and what LaRouche said about that last week, very pregnantly, he said, this policy came from me, and I'm going to back it up 100%. So that's an indication. The thing has to be cleared out. It's not necessarily the case that if we dump Obama, in fact, the shock of that would also have a broader impact. But those shock waves have already hit. I mean, what the banks have done, the crimes they've committed, what they've gotten away with. This really is underlying it, issue number one, among a large portion of the American population. So as soon as a presidential candidate is gone with it, he's become a magnet for a tremendous amount of attention and potential support. And as Lynn said, we created it. We're going to back it up.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul. That's great.
Thank you.
It's very late over there, and as we say here in Australia, when you're driving home, please watch out for kangaroos. So I'll see you again. Thanks very much, Paul.
All right. I'll let you know if I hit any.